The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like everyone's holding their breath without realizing it. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in the air, but no one noticed. All eyes were on the man slowly making his way down the center aisle. He moved with effort. One hand gripped a worn wooden cane. The other steadied himself against the back of a bench. His steps were careful, deliberate, as if each one cost him something. He wore a simple button-down shirt, slightly wrinkled, and dark slacks. Nothing fancy. Nothing that screamed important, just a man showing up, like thousands did every day in courthouses across the country. At the bench, the judge sat upright, fingers steepled, expression unreadable at first. But as the man approached the plaintiff's table, the judge's lips twitched, not in a smile, but something sharper. He glanced at his clerk, then back at the man, and let out a soft, impatient sigh that carried farther than he probably intended. "Is this the Johnson matter?" the judge asked, voice dry. "Yes, Your Honor," the man replied. His voice was calm, steady. He placed a folder on the table and straightened as best he could. The judge raised an eyebrow. "You're representing yourself?" "I am." A pause. Then, with a tone that dripped with condescension, the judge said, "Well, I hope you've reviewed the local rules. We don't have time for improvisation." He didn't say people like you, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The bailiff looked down at his shoes. The opposing attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, smirked faintly, as if this were exactly what he'd expected. But the man at the plaintiff's table didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "I've reviewed the rules, Your Honor, and the case law. I've also filed a motion in limine regarding the defendant's prior conduct, which I believe is directly relevant." The judge blinked, surprised for a split second, then recovered quickly. "Oh, you've read case law, have you?" There was a chuckle in his voice now, mocking. "Tell me, did you find that in a pamphlet at the VA hospital?" The room went colder. Someone coughed. The man didn't react with anger. He just looked at the judge, eyes clear and steady, like he'd seen this kind of thing before. And worse. "Actually," he said evenly, "I studied it at night, after physical therapy. Same place I earned my law degree." That gave the judge pause. "Just for a heartbeat." Then he waved a hand dismissively. "Spare me the sob story. This isn't a support group. This is a court of law." But the man wasn't telling a sob story. He was stating facts. And there was something in the way he held himself, quiet, grounded, that made a few people in the back rows lean forward. The case itself was small on paper, a dispute over denied disability accommodations by a local business. Nothing flashy, no millions at stake. But for the man, it wasn't about money. It was about being seen, heard, treated like a person. Not a problem to be shuffled aside, he began to speak, carefully, clearly, about the Americans with Disabilities Act, about reasonable accommodation, about how the business had refused even basic requests. A ramp, a wider doorway, a little patience. He cited specific sections of the law, referenced a recent federal ruling from the Ninth Circuit, and explained how it applied here. The judge tapped his pen. "Cute," he muttered. "But precedent doesn't override common sense. Maybe if you'd asked nicely instead of threatening lawsuits." "I did ask nicely," the man said gently. "For 6 months. They ignored every letter, every call. Even when I offered to help design the ramp myself." Now the judge leaned back, arms crossed. "And now you want the court to force a small business owner to rebuild his entrance because you can't manage a step?" The words landed like stones, harsh, unfair. The man's jaw tightened just slightly, but he didn't raise his voice. "No, Your Honor," he said. "I want the court to uphold the law. The same law that says no one should be turned away because of how their body works, or doesn't." For the first time, the opposing attorney looked uneasy. He shuffled his papers, avoiding eye contact. The judge scoffed. "You sound like you've practiced that line." "I've lived it," the man replied. A silence stretched. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. Inside, the clock on the wall ticked loudly. Then the judge stood abruptly. "This hearing is going nowhere. You're unprepared, emotional, and frankly wasting the court's time. I'm adjourning for recess. Be back in 20 minutes and bring someone who actually knows procedure." He banged the gavel once, sharp and final, and strode out through the side door without another glance. The courtroom exhaled. People started whispering. Some shook their heads. Others just packed up and left as if nothing unusual had happened. But the man didn't move. He stayed at the table, hands resting on the wood, eyes closed for a moment. Not in defeat, but in focus, like he was gathering something deep inside. An elderly woman in the front row stood slowly and walked over. She didn't say much, just placed a hand on his shoulder for a second, gave a small nod, and walked out. He opened his eyes, looked around, saw the clerk watching him from the bench, expression unreadable, saw the bailiff pretending to be busy with a clipboard, saw the opposing attorney already on his phone, probably texting about how easy this would be to win. But the man wasn't thinking about winning, not in the way most people meant it. He was thinking about why he'd come here in the first place. Not for himself. For the next person who might walk through those doors with a cane, a wheelchair, a stutter, or a mind that worked differently, and be treated like they didn't belong. He picked up his folder, smoothed a crease, took a slow breath and waited. 20 minutes later, the bailiff called the court back to order. The judge re-entered, robe crisp, expression unreadable again. He sat, adjusted his glasses and glanced at the docket. "Johnson matter," he said flatly. The man stood. "Ready, Your Honor." The judge stared at him for a long moment. Then, almost as an afterthought, asked, "So, you really went to law school?" The man didn't smile, didn't gloat. Just said, "Yes, and you served?" "A beat." "I did." The judge frowned as if trying to place him. But before he could ask more, the man added quietly, "I've sat where you sit, Your Honor, and I've learned that robes don't make the judge, character does." The words landed softly, but they hit hard. The judge's pen stopped moving. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something closer to confusion. Then he cleared his throat. "Proceed," he said. But this time his voice lacked its earlier edge. And as the man began to speak again, this time with even greater clarity, something in the room had shifted. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but enough that everyone felt it, because sometimes dignity doesn't shout. It just stands, quietly, firmly, and refuses to be erased. The courtroom felt different when they returned after recess, less like a battlefield, more like a room holding its breath. The judge sat straighter, his earlier smirk gone. He kept glancing at the man across the bench, as if trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't realized existed. But the story wasn't just about what happened inside those walls. It stretched back years, into dusty barracks, hospital rooms with too bright lights, and late nights spent hunched over law books with aching limbs and a mind that refused to quit. Long before the cane, before the courtroom, before the judge's sharp words, there was a young man in uniform. He'd signed up not for glory, but because he believed in something bigger than himself. He trained hard, led quietly, and earned the trust of those around him without ever asking for it. Then came the day everything changed. A mission gone wrong, an explosion in a narrow alley overseas, and a silence that followed louder than any gunfire. He woke up in a military hospital thousands of miles from home. His leg was saved, but barely. Nerves damaged. Muscles torn. Doctors spoke in careful tones about adjusting expectations. But he didn't adjust, he adapted. While others healed in body, he healed in purpose. During long rehab sessions, while relearning how to stand, he started reading. First letters from home, then legal journals someone had left in the waiting room. Something clicked. He'd always believed in fairness. Now he wanted to understand how to protect it. Years later, after countless surgeries, sleepless nights, and more than a few setbacks, he graduated law school. Not at the top of his class, but with a quiet determination that impressed even the toughest professors. He passed the bar on his second try, not because he wasn't smart enough the first time, but because chronic pain had flared during the exam, clouding his focus. He didn't complain. He just tried again. He eventually became a judge himself, not in a flashy federal court, but in a quieter corner of the legal world, administrative law. There he handled cases most people never heard about. Veterans' benefits, workplace discrimination, disability claims. He ruled with precision, yes, but also with empathy. He knew what it felt like to be doubted, dismissed, told you were exaggerating your pain or milking the system. He retired early, not because he wanted to, but because his body finally said enough. Yet retirement didn't mean stopping. He started volunteering with legal aid groups, helping people who couldn't afford lawyers navigate a system that often felt stacked against them. He took on small cases like this one, not for money, not for fame, but because someone had to stand in the gap. Meanwhile, the judge presiding over the courtroom had taken a very different path. He'd climbed the legal ladder fast, sharp mind, sharp pursuits, always saying the right thing to the right people. He built a reputation for clearing the docket, for moving cases along like factory lines. Efficiency became his idol. Over time, compassion got filed under unnecessary delays. He'd never served in the military, never spent a night in a hospital wondering if he'd walk again, never been told his pain wasn't visible enough to count. So when he saw a man with a cane, speaking calmly about rights and dignity, his first instinct wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion. And worse, superiority. Back in court, the man continued his argument. He spoke about how the business in question had received multiple requests for simple accommodations. Nothing extravagant, just a ramp and a doorway wide enough for a wheelchair. Each request was ignored, then mocked in internal emails later uncovered during discovery. The owner wrote, the man said, reading from a printed page, "If he can't handle a step, maybe he shouldn't be shopping here." He paused. "That's not just rude, Your Honor, it's illegal." The judge shifted in his seat. "That's one email," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier bite. "One email that reflects a pattern," the man replied, "and patterns matter in discrimination cases." He then cited a recent appellate decision, clear, precise, with the exact citation. The kind of detail only someone deeply familiar with the law would know. The clerk at the side table, an older woman who'd worked in the courthouse for 30 years, stiffened. Her eyes widened slightly. She leaned over and whispered something to the judge. The judge frowned. "What?" She handed him a slip of paper. He read it, his face changed, just a flicker, but enough. He looked up at the man, really looked this time as if seeing him for the first time. "You referenced Martinez versus Horizon Retail," the judge said slowly. "I did. That case was decided last month. It's not even published in the main reporters yet." "I read the advance sheets," the man said simply. "I also attended the oral arguments." "From the public gallery?" The judge stared. "You were there?" "Yes," silence stretched. The opposing attorney, who'd been doodling on a legal pad, stopped. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. Then the man added almost gently, "Your Honor, I've sat where you sit. And I've learned that robes don't make the judge, character does." The words weren't a threat. They weren't even a boast. They were an invitation to remember why they were both there. The judge didn't respond right away. He looked down at his notes, then at the clerk, then back at the man. Something was stirring behind his eyes. Confusion, maybe shame, maybe the first crack in a wall he'd built over years. Outside, a breeze rustled the trees. Inside, the air felt charged, like before a storm breaks, the man didn't press. He just waited. He'd learned long ago that truth doesn't need to shout. Sometimes it just needs space to be heard. During the next break, the clerk pulled the judge aside near the coffee machine in the back hallway. "Do you know who that is?" she asked quietly. "I'm starting to wonder," he admitted. She pulled out her phone, tapped a few times, and showed him a photo. It was from a judicial conference 2 years ago. In it, the man stood tall, no cane, wearing full judicial robes, shaking hands with a state Supreme Court justice. The caption read, "Honoring 20 years of service in administrative law." The judge's breath caught. "That's him?" "That's him," she said. "Retired, but still active in pro bono work. He's helped overturn dozens of wrongful denials for veterans and disabled workers. People respect him, not because of his title, but because of how he treats people." The judge stared at the photo. In it, the man was smiling, not broadly, but with warmth. The kind of smile that comes from knowing you've done right by someone. Back in the courtroom, the man stepped outside for a moment. He didn't go far, just to the bench under the oak tree in the courthouse yard. A small group was already waiting. A young veteran in a wheelchair, an older woman with a service dog, a couple of law students from the local university. They greeted him like family. "You okay in there?" the veteran asked. "Getting there," he said, sitting carefully. "You always do," the woman said, handing him a bottle of water. "You never let them break you." He smiled faintly. They don't get to decide my worth. No one does. Inside, the judge sat alone in his chambers, robe still on, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he felt uneasy. Not about the case, but about himself. Had he become the kind of judge who saw people as files, not faces? Had he forgotten that the law was meant to protect the vulnerable, not just process them? He thought about his own father, who'd worked a factory job for 40 years with bad knees and never complained. Would he have been treated with respect in this courtroom? The recess ended. The bailiff called everyone back. The judge walked in slowly, more thoughtfully than before, and when the man returned to the plaintiff's table, cane in hand, posture calm, the judge didn't interrupt. He didn't smirk. He simply said, "Please continue," because sometimes all it takes is one moment of clarity and one person who refuses to be invisible to remind us what justice really looks like. The courtroom felt different this time, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because something had shifted underneath. The judge sat quieter, his earlier impatience replaced by a kind of watchful stillness. He kept glancing at the man across the room, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to curiosity. Maybe even doubt about his own assumptions. During the recess, the clerk had shown him that photo, the one from the judicial conference. It wasn't just proof of who the man was, it was a mirror, and the reflection wasn't flattering. Now, as the man returned to the plaintiff's table, he moved the same way he had before, slow, careful, leaning on his cane. But there was a new weight to his presence, as if the air around him had thickened with quiet authority. He didn't say a word. He just opened his folder, smoothed a page, and waited. The judge cleared his throat. "You may continue," he said, voice lower than before. The man nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." He turned to the opposing attorney. "I'd like to address the defendant's claim that providing a ramp would cause undue hardship." He spoke clearly, without flourish. He explained how the business in question had recently renovated its interior, new flooring, updated lighting, even a fresh coat of paint. Yet when asked to install a simple prefabricated ramp, costing under $2,000, they claimed it was too expensive and logistically impossible. Their own financial records, he said, show a profit margin of over 15% last year. They spent more on holiday decorations than the ramp would cost. A few people in the gallery murmured. The opposing attorney shifted in his seat but didn't object. He knew the evidence was solid. Then the man did something unexpected. He pulled out a small blueprint, not fancy, just hand-drawn on legal paper. "I designed this myself," he said, holding it up. "It fits within their existing structure. No permits needed. Local contractors confirmed it could be installed in one day." The judge leaned forward slightly. "You designed it?" "Yes. I've helped design accessibility modifications for over 30 small businesses, free of charge. Most owners are grateful once they see it's not a burden, just a matter of doing the right thing." There was no pride in his voice, just fact, like saying he'd fixed a leaky faucet or helped a neighbor carry groceries. The judge looked down at his notes, then back up. "And you've done this while managing your own injuries?" The man met his gaze. "My injuries don't stop me from helping others. They remind me why it matters." The words landed softly, but they carried. Even the bailiff, who'd been standing near the door with his usual blank expression, gave a small nod. Outside, the afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. Inside, the tension wasn't gone, but it had changed. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about whether fairness still had a place here. During the next short break, the judge stepped into his chambers and closed the door. He didn't call anyone. Didn't pace. He just sat at his desk and stared at the photo the clerk had shown him. In it, the man stood straight, robe crisp, eyes calm. No cane, no pain showing, just dignity. He thought about his own rise through the legal ranks, the late nights, the polished speeches, the carefully curated reputation. He'd always believed he was fair. But fairness wasn't just about following rules. It was about seeing people. Really seeing them. Had he done that today? Or had he seen only a limp, a cane, a man who didn't fit his idea of someone who belonged in court? Meanwhile, out in the hallway, the man sat on a bench near the water fountain. A young law student approached, nervous but determined. "Sir," she said, I watched your argument. It was powerful." He looked up and smiled gently. "Thank you." "I'm interning with legal aid this summer," she went on. I've seen so many people turned away because they couldn't afford a lawyer or didn't sound professional enough. It's like the system isn't built for them. It wasn't, he said quietly, but it can be rebuilt. One case at a time, she hesitated. Do you ever get tired of fighting for people who might never know your name? He thought for a moment. I get tired in my body, yes, but not in my heart. Because every time someone walks through a door they were told they couldn't or gets the help they were denied, that's enough. She nodded, eyes bright. I want to be like that. You already are, he said. You showed up. That's where it starts. Back in court, the judge returned with a new resolve. Not to save face, but to do right. When the hearing resumed, he didn't interrupt. He listened. Really listened. As the man laid out his final points about precedent, about human dignity, about the spirit of the law, the judge took notes. Not just legal notes, human ones. Then, just before closing arguments, the man did something no one expected. He placed his cane against the table and stood. Not quickly. Not dramatically. But steadily. He straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and looked the judge in the eye, not as a petitioner, not as a disabled man begging for help, but as an equal. The courtroom fell utterly silent. I use the cane, he said, voice calm but firm. Not because I can't walk, but because my body carries the cost of service. Some days are harder than others. Today I chose to stand, not to prove anything to you, Your Honor, but to remind us both that appearances lie. He paused. You saw a man with a limp and assumed weakness. But weakness isn't in how someone walks. It's in how someone treats others when they think no one's watching. The judge didn't look away. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear. He'd been seen. Not judged, just seen. The man continued. I didn't come here for pity. I came because a small business broke the law. And if we let that slide because the victim doesn't look like a victim, then the law means nothing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth was loud enough on its own. When he finished, he picked up his cane again, not as a symbol of limitation, but as a tool, like a lawyer's briefcase or a teacher's chalk. Then he sat down. No one clapped. No one spoke. But something had changed in the room. You could feel it in the way people sat up straighter, in the way the opposing attorney wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, in the quiet respect that now filled the space where mockery had been. The judge took a deep breath. Thank you, he said simply. And for the first time that day, it sounded like he meant it. He announced a short recess before closing arguments. Just 10 minutes. But in those 10 minutes, everything had shifted. Because sometimes standing up isn't about legs. It's about refusing to let the world define your worth. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is show up. Not as a hero, not as a victim, but as a human being who still believes in justice, even when it's hard. The 10-minute recess stretched longer than it should have. Not because anyone was stalling, but because something heavy had settled over the courtroom and no one wanted to break it too soon. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long golden streaks across the pavement. Inside, people sat quietly, as if afraid to disturb the shift that had just taken place. The man stayed at the plaintiff's table. He didn't pace, didn't check his phone, just sat with his hands folded, eyes closed, breathing slowly. He wasn't praying exactly, more like gathering himself. Like a soldier before a final charge, not with anger, but with purpose. Across the room, the judge remained in his chambers. He hadn't called for coffee, hadn't reviewed notes. He just stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot, the courthouse steps, the ordinary people coming and going, some limping, some in wheelchairs, some leaning on canes just like the one he'd mocked hours earlier. How many times had he dismissed them without a second thought? How many cases had he rushed through, assuming he already knew the story before it was told? He thought about his oath, the one he'd taken years ago, hand on a book, voice steady. To uphold justice, not efficiency. Not speed, justice, and justice wasn't a machine. It was a promise to see people, not just paperwork. When the bailiff called the court back to order, everyone returned slowly, almost reverently. Even the opposing attorney looked different, less smug, more subdued. He kept his eyes on his notes, avoiding the plaintiff's table altogether. The judge re-entered with measured steps. He didn't bang the gavel, didn't announce himself with authority. He simply sat, adjusted his glasses, and said, We'll now hear closing arguments. The opposing attorney stood first. His voice was quieter than before. He stuck to the facts barely. No grand claims. No dramatic flourishes. Just a dry recitation of legal points, most of which had already been dismantled. When he sat down, it was with the air of someone who knew he'd lost, even if the ruling hadn't come yet. Then it was the man's turn. He rose, but this time, he didn't reach for his cane right away. He stood fully upright, shoulders back, posture strong. The pain was still there, he'd felt it all day, but he chose in this moment to let his strength show. Not to impress, not to shame, but to bear witness. Your Honor, he began, voice calm but caring. I didn't come here to win a trophy. I came because someone was told they didn't belong. He spoke slowly, like he was talking to a friend over coffee, not arguing before a judge. The law says everyone deserves access. Not just the able-bodied, not just the loud or the polished, everyone. That includes the veteran who uses a walker, the mother in a wheelchair trying to buy school supplies, the teenager with an invisible illness who gets told, "You don't look sick." He paused. But laws on paper mean nothing if the people who enforce them forget what those laws are for. He looked directly at the judge, not with accusation, but with honesty. Earlier today, you saw a cane and assumed I didn't know the law, that I was here to waste your time. Maybe you thought I was just another sad story looking for a handout. The judge didn't look away. His throat moved as he swallowed. But here's the truth, the man continued. I've spent my life trying to make sure people like me aren't invisible. Not because I want special treatment, but because I want equal treatment. And that starts with being seen as human. He didn't mention his service, didn't bring up his past role as a judge. He didn't need to. His words carried their own weight. Today, he said, this courtroom became more than a place for rulings. It became a test. A test of whether dignity still matters in the law, whether fairness is just a word or something we live. He glanced around, not at the gallery, not at the attorneys, but at the room itself, as if speaking to the walls, the benches, the very idea of justice. If we allow businesses to turn people away because they're inconvenient, if we let judges mock those who show up with canes or scars or quiet voices, then we've already lost. Not just this case, the whole point of it all. His voice softened. I faced worse than a judge's scorn. I've faced explosions, hospital beds, nights wondering if I'd ever walk again. But the hardest thing? Being told my pain doesn't count because it's not visible, being treated like a burden instead of a person. He took a breath. So I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for what the law already promises, fairness, consistency, respect. Then quietly, and maybe, a little humility from those who hold power. He sat down. No flourish. No dramatic pause. Just the soft sound of fabric as he lowered himself into his chair and picked up his cane again. Not as a prop, but as part of his truth. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, of reflection, of shame, of something like hope. The judge didn't speak right away. He looked down at his hands, then at the docket, then at the man. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive, it was changed. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost gentle. Thank you, he said. And this time it wasn't just a formality. It was real. He didn't rule from the bench right then. He said he needed time to review the record, to consider the arguments fully. But everyone in the room knew the outcome was no longer in doubt. As people filed out, something unusual happened. The elderly woman from the front row stopped by the plaintiff's table. She didn't say much, just placed a hand on his arm and whispered, "You reminded us what's right." A young court officer, barely out of his 20s, gave a small nod as he passed. Even the clerk offered a quiet, "Well said." The man didn't smile broadly. He just nodded back, eyes warm. He'd done what he came to do. Not just for his client, but for everyone who'd ever been made to feel small in a place that was supposed to protect them. Outside, the air was cooler now. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. He walked slowly down the courthouse steps, cane tapping lightly on each one. But his step was firmer than when he'd arrived. At the bottom, a small group waited. Not reporters, not fans, just people who knew what this day meant. A veteran in a wheelchair, a woman with a guide dog, a teenager holding a folder labeled "My Case." They didn't cheer. They didn't swarm him. They just stood there together in quiet solidarity. He looked at them and said simply, "Keep showing up. That's how we change things." And as he walked away, not toward fame or recognition, but toward the next person who needed help, the truth settled over the courthouse like evening light. Real strength isn't in never falling. It's in standing back up, even when the world expects you to stay down. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show up exactly as you are and refuse to be erased. A week after the hearing, the ruling came down. Not with fanfare, not with a press release, but in a quiet, typed order delivered to both parties by email and filed in the public record. The judge ruled in favor of the plaintiff, not just on the narrow legal issue, but with words that carried weight far beyond the case itself. He wrote that denying reasonable accommodation wasn't just a technical violation, it was a failure of basic decency. He cited the precedent the man had referenced, acknowledged the pattern of disregard by the business, and ordered them to install the ramp within 30 days. But more than that, he added a paragraph that surprised even seasoned courthouse regulars. "Justice," he wrote, "is not measured only in rulings, but in how we treat those who come before us, especially when they are vulnerable, overlooked, or dismissed." Today, this court was reminded that dignity is not optional. It is the foundation. No one expected that, especially not from a judge known for brisk efficiency and dry rulings. But something had shifted, and it showed. Word spread, not through viral videos or sensational headlines, but through legal aid offices, veteran centers, and community meetings. People talked about it over coffee, in waiting rooms, at support group tables. Not as gossip, but as hope. "Did you hear about the case downtown? The one where the judge actually listened?" The business owner, to his credit, didn't appeal. Maybe it was the evidence. Maybe it was shame. Or maybe, just maybe, he realized he'd been wrong. Within 3 weeks, the ramp was installed. Simple, sturdy, painted the same color as the building. A small sign appeared near the entrance. "All are welcome." Meanwhile, the man didn't celebrate with a press conference or a victory tour. He went back to his routine. Early mornings, physical therapy, coffee with a neighbor who'd lost her husband to illness and needed someone to talk to. Evenings spent reviewing case files for people who couldn't afford lawyers. But things were different now. Not because of fame, he avoided it, but because people trusted him more. Not as a hero, but as someone who'd stood in the fire and come out still kind. A few weeks later, he received a letter. Not from a court, not from a lawyer, but from a high school student working on a civics project. The student had read about the case in a local newsletter and wanted to interview someone who fought for fairness without yelling. He agreed. They met at a quiet diner, not a courthouse. Over pancakes, the student asked, "How do you keep going when people treat you like you don't matter?" He thought for a moment, stirring his coffee. "Because someone always notices," he said. "Maybe not the person in power, maybe not right away, but someone sees you trying, and that's enough to keep going." The student wrote a short essay. It won a small award. More importantly, it reminded a classroom full of teenagers that justice isn't just for judges in robes. It's for anyone who chooses to care. Back at the courthouse, the judge began doing things no one expected. He started arriving early to review case files more carefully, especially those involving disability claims or self-represented litigants. He asked his clerk to compile a list of local legal aid resources and began handing them out quietly during recesses. He even signed up for a judicial training on implicit bias, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He never publicly apologized. But actions spoke louder. In a later hearing, when a woman with a stutter struggled to explain her case, he didn't interrupt. He waited, nodded, said, "Take your time." And when she finished, he ruled fairly, based on facts, not frustration. People noticed, not with applause, but with quiet respect. Court staff began treating litigants with more patience. Attorneys stopped rolling their eyes at prosy clients. Small changes, yes, but real ones. One afternoon, months later, the man returned to the same courthouse, not for a case, but to speak at a new mentorship program for young public defenders. The judge attended, sitting in the back, not in robes, just as a listener. After the talk, they didn't exchange grand words. Just a nod in the hallway, a brief pause. Then the judge said, "You were right. About character." The man simply replied, "We all get chances to do better. You took yours, no drama." No scorekeeping. Just two people acknowledging a shared humanity. The story didn't end with a trophy or a headline. It ended where it began, with ordinary people choosing to do the right thing even when it's hard. One crisp morning not long after, the man visited a VA hospital on the edge of town. He wasn't there as a lawyer or a former judge, just as himself. He sat with a young veteran who'd lost part of his leg in an accident and was struggling to get his housing benefits approved. The veteran was frustrated, angry, ready to give up. "I keep getting told I don't qualify," he said, voice tight, like I'm lying about my own pain. The man didn't offer empty comfort. He pulled out a notepad. "Let's go through it together," he said. Line by line. For 2 hours they worked, filling forms, citing regulations, drafting a letter. No rush, no judgment, just presence. When they finished, the young man looked up. "Why do you do this?" "You don't even know me," the man smiled faintly. "Because someone once did it for me, and because no one should have to fight alone." Outside, the sun rose higher, warming the pavement. Birds called from the trees. Life went on, messy, imperfect, but full of quiet chances to make things right. And as he walked to his car, cane in hand, shoulders a little tired but spirit steady, he knew the truth. Heroes aren't always the ones on stages. Sometimes they're the ones who show up with a folder, a kind word, and the courage to stand, even when the world expects them to stay silent. Some wear capes. Others wear canes. And still they stand taller than the rest.